Dear, greetings, how are you? Today I want to show you the most advanced use case for which the add-on is different. I mean, when we need to do a post-processing, a custom composition from Photoshop. As you know, Photoshop does not have native OpenEXR support. Given this in the market, there are free Photoshop plugins that seek to provide Photoshop with this capability that it does not have natively. And in the case of Blender and other similar software, it does not natively support writing PSD files. That is, we do not have the opportunity to have PSD files from our software with our renders for further post-processing, either from a PNG, a JPG, a Cineon, and so on and so forth. This add-on gives Blender the ability to write files, your renders, directly to PSD. But in this specific case with OpenEXR, either normal without layers or the multi-layer, which includes the render passes, the latter very used for professional compositing or visual effects. I have this scene as an example. In this case, I have activated the following render passes: Z depth, which is the depth map, the mist, the normal, the diffuse, the glossy, the transmission, because it is a beer bottle, the ambient occlusion, and I want to use as cryptomates certain objects and certain materials. But in this case, as the scene is enough with the objects, I think it's not necessary to choose the materials, so I'm going to exclude them. For our example, after rendering, we are not going to use the Z depth, nor the mist itself, nor the normal or the ambient occlusion. I am going to leave them marked so that you can see that the add-on has the capacity to write the PSD files with those render passes. In the documentation is detailed what are the add-on scope, among other things, but roughly speaking, the add-on supports most of the most used render passes. But it is important to clarify that all this is only for still images, not animations. Now, when we go to Photoshop, we are going to use diffuse, glossy, and transmission, mainly to see how they can be combined in Photoshop and make it possible to compose an image just the way you want it. So for this aspect, after you install the add-on, in Preferences, that from Blender 4.2, it is done from Get Extension, you will see in the Output Properties this option of Imago PSD almost at the end, where you will be able to interact with the add-on. The add-on, for now, only allows you to choose a single input file format, which Photoshop will read. The add-on will read it and convert it into PSD, and in the case that you have chosen Cryptomate, given that the input format is OpenEXR multilayer, which is the only case in which we will use Cryptomate, you select in the UI of the add-on either object, material, or asset, and choose from the list that the add-on gives you the materials, objects, or assets. And when you have everything done, you will sync in Render PSD, right? Then we can pass, here is the list of the accepted formats, as we have put them in the documentation, and in this case we are going to choose OpenEXR multilayer of 32 bits, and for now, the codecs that we accept are ZIP and RLE. After this, we are going to put the exact path where we want our file saved, and we will proceed to name it. This is a mandatory step for the resulting file. Then, we could put, for example, example, and we could choose the objects that we want. In this case, I identified that I want the moss, and then, if you have difficulties in identifying, you can first find out what the name is and look for it in the list, and add it, and it will automatically generate a list for you. In future updates, we will make this a little more intuitive with an eyedropper so that you can choose the type of object. I recommend that if you don't know the name, you can also select the object from the viewport, for example, this lid. And before we start rendering, I would like to clarify something. Generally, the add-on is faster if you are doing it in a file format other than OpenEXR. But in this case, as we have several render passes and given that with Cryptomates, the processing is a little heavier. Depending on your computer, processing times will increase more or not. So generally, if you have a good computer, it will take less time to render. Therefore, I recommend, and this is how I do when I am using the add-on, that in principle you launch Blender from the console so that you can see, once the rendering is finished in real time from the Blender UI, in the background, how the add-on is processing, so that you are aware that the process is not finished. And, in addition, have certainty that Blender has not frozen as such. The add-on, after finishing rendering, works in the background and freezes Blender temporarily so that you do not continue using the scene. So I recommend that you always, if you are going to use the OpenXR multilayer, if there are several render passes, and especially if they include cryptomates, start it from the console so that you have an awareness of the steps of the process, and there is no confusion, okay? So, in this case, for example, here I started Blender from the console, and if, for example, I start it here, and I sync render PSD, let's see how we do. The rendering process on my computer is a little bit slower because I do it with CPU, so you have to be a little bit more patient. So, as I am telling you, for example, look at the message that appears in the console, started rendering process, and here it will announce many more processes, etc., etc., until the last process is to save the PSD, okay? So let's wait a moment for it to finish, and we'll continue. It has already finished rendering, and as you can see, it has taken approximately 25 minutes. Here you can see the history of everything that happened from the time of rendering, which took approximately about 10 minutes, and all the processing process in the background, which involved the OpenXR. And as you can see here, for example, the resulting file is a PSD, which we are going to open immediately. Once we have rendered, we open in Photoshop the resulting file, and as you will see, we are going to find the render passes. In this case, we find the ambient occlusion. The first image should be the beauty image, the combined render, properly speaking, without any kind of look transform applied. It is the totally pure image waiting to be post-processed. However, using it this way is not enough, because it implies less compositing and different effects, right? So that's why artists choose to have this kind of render passes available in Photoshop. Here, we have the depth map. That's the color diffuse, that's the diffuse direct, that's the diffuse indirect, that's the glossy color, glossy direct, glossy indirect, the mist, the noisy, the normal, transmission, and cryptomates.
Imago PSD. Imago PSD. Photoshop PSD.